The dusty corridors of Florence hold secrets that have echoed through centuries, whispers of power, strategy, and survival that shaped the world's understanding of human nature. Niccolo Machiavelli, standing at the precipice of Renaissance ambition, observed something that most people prefer to ignore. The world operates on different rules than those taught in churches and philosophy halls. His observations, born from decades of political intrigue and personal humiliation, reveal a truth that remains uncomfortable but undeniably practical. The man who walks through this world with clear eyes must learn to recognize three dangerous types of people. For proximity to them is not merely unpleasant, it is potentially fatal to one's ambitions and peace of mind. The contemporary world, for all its technological advancement and supposed enlightenment, follows the same patterns Machiavelli identified 5 centuries ago. The human landscape remains populated by individuals whose nature and behavior patterns predict their outcomes with almost scientific precision. To survive and flourish, one must develop what Machiavelli understood as political wisdom, the ability to see people not as they pretend to be, but as they actually are. This is not cruelty, it is clarity. This is not pessimism, it is accuracy. The foundation of Machiavelli's philosophy rests on a radical premise that most modern self-help literature refuses to acknowledge. Not everyone deserves your time, energy, or investment. In fact, certain types of people are fundamentally incompatible with success, and their presence in your life operates like a virus, slowly corrupting your judgment and draining your resources. The first lesson in the cold mathematics of survival is learning to identify these types before they become entrenched in your circle. Consider the man who has spent years observing power in action, watching it accumulate, transform, and destroy. He learns that certain individuals appear and reappear in the lives of successful people, and they always play the same role: the parasite, the saboteur, the anchor. These are not abstractions or personality types from a psychology textbook. They are specific categories of human beings whose behavior follows predictable patterns and whose presence in your life works directly against your interests. The first type that Machiavelli's wisdom warns us to avoid is the perpetually envious person. This individual is consumed by a gnawing resentment of others' success, and more critically, of your potential success. The envious person does not merely dislike your achievement, they experience it as a personal injury. When you rise, something in them feels diminished. When you gain, they feel they have lost. This is not a feeling they can overcome through motivation or positive thinking, because envy is not a thought, it is a fundamental orientation toward the world. The envious person presents a particular danger because they often cloak their nature in the language of friendship and concern. They appear to celebrate your victories while their eyes betray something else entirely. They offer advice that sounds reasonable, but subtly undermines your confidence. They share cautionary tales about others who attempted what you're attempting. They plant seeds of doubt not through obvious criticism, but through the insidious practice of pointing out potential problems with such frequency and emphasis that your own vision becomes clouded. Over time, the envious person creates a gravitational field of negativity around you that pulls your focus downward. What makes the envious person particularly dangerous is that their envy is not situational, it is constitutional. They are not envious because circumstances have frustrated them. They are envious because they lack the internal resources to celebrate another person's success. The envious person, Machiavelli understood, can never be satisfied, because their satisfaction would require acknowledging your superiority in some domain. Their nature compels them to diminish, question, and ultimately sabotage. They may not do this consciously or with dramatic betrayal. Instead, they work through subtle erosion, through the constant application of doubt, through the strategic questioning of your judgment. The practical observation is this: the envious person cannot be reformed through kindness or through including them more fully in your success. The more you elevate them or attempt to make them part of your journey, the more their envy grows, because now they are directly confronted with the gap between your position and theirs. The only rational response is distance. This is not punishment. It is simply recognizing reality and acting accordingly. To keep the envious person close is to invite slow-motion sabotage into your most important endeavors. The second dangerous type that emerges from Machiavelli's observation of human nature is the chronic complainer, the person who has made suffering their identity and who experiences your success as an implicit criticism of their failure to succeed. This person is consumed by the story of their victimization. They have internalized a narrative in which the world has treated them unfairly, and they maintain this narrative with remarkable dedication. Every setback confirms their theory. Every success of others is evidence of cosmic injustice. The chronic complainer differs from someone who has experienced genuine hardship. Hardship can be a teacher and can create wisdom, but the chronic complainer has transformed their difficulties into a permanent identity. They have decided that their suffering entitles them to something: attention, sympathy, validation, or rescue. They unconsciously seek to spread their misery because misery shared feels less heavy. When you achieve something, their immediate response is to generate reasons why your achievement is meaningless, undeserved, or hollow. This person is dangerous because they operate as an emotional anchor. If you remain in proximity to them, they will work to pull you down into their world of grievance and complaint. They do this not through dramatic betrayal, but through the normalization of negativity. They teach you, through constant example, that the world is rigged, that effort is futile, and that success is illusory or corrupt. Their complaints become the background radiation of your life, and gradually, almost without noticing, you begin to internalize their worldview. The chronic complainer also has the particular talent of appearing noble in their suffering. They are so focused on what they have lost that they have become invisible to what they could gain. They transform their own stagnation into a moral statement, implying that those who succeed have simply not been tested enough or have compromised their principles. When you attempt to encourage them to action, they respond with reasons why their circumstances are uniquely impossible. When you share your own struggles, they listen not to understand, but to measure whether their suffering is greater than yours. Machiavelli's cold wisdom here is straightforward. The chronic complainer is a drain on your energy and your vision. They are not moving in the direction of growth, and they experience your movement in that direction as a betrayal or an implicit judgment. The only rational response is to create distance. This distance is not cruel. It is necessary. You cannot lift someone who is determined to remain on the ground. And in attempting to do so, you will only compromise your own ascent. The third type that the wise man learns to identify and avoid is the betrayer, the person who has demonstrated through their actions that they will sacrifice your interests for their own at the moment when it becomes profitable to do so. The betrayer is perhaps the most dangerous because they are the most subtle. They do not announce themselves. Instead, they embed themselves in your trust and then extract value at the critical moment. The betrayer comes in many forms, but they share essential characteristics. They are skilled at reading people and understanding what others want to hear. They are adaptable, appearing to be whatever is needed at any given moment. They are patient, willing to invest time in relationships because they understand that trust is the currency they need to acquire before they can betray it. Most dangerously, the betrayer often cannot predict their own future actions with certainty. They rationalize their betrayal in the moment, telling themselves that circumstances have changed or that their interests have suddenly become paramount. The identifying characteristic of the betrayer is a pattern of small compromises. They have bent their principles before. They have justified abandoning others when it was convenient. They have a history of relationships that ended badly, but in their telling, they are always the victim. When you look at their track record objectively, you see a consistent pattern. When pressure comes and their interests conflict with their commitments, they choose themselves, every single time. The critical error most people make with betrayers is assuming that they will be different with them, that the betrayer's past behavior is somehow not predictive of future behavior. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. People do not change at their core. The betrayer does not become loyal simply because you offer loyalty. They become more comfortable and more dangerous because now they have greater access to your vulnerabilities. Machiavelli's observation is that the betrayer should be identified as early as possible and removed from positions of trust. This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. The person who betrayed others will betray you, not because they are evil, but because they operate according to a different moral calculus than the one you use. When their interests conflict with their obligations, their interests win. This is their nature, and it will not change. The prevention of betrayal is simpler than the management of it. Keep betrayers at a distance. Never give them information they could weaponize. Never make them integral to your plans or dependent on your success. Watch them carefully, and when they show their true nature, for they always do, act decisively to remove them from your life. Do not demand apologies or demand that they acknowledge their wrongdoing. Simply accept what they have shown you and adjust accordingly. Having identified these three dangerous types, Machiavelli's wisdom takes a dramatic turn. For understanding how to avoid toxic people is only half the equation. The other half, and in many ways the more important half, involves understanding what must be destroyed within yourself if you are to avoid becoming the victim of such people. This is where the philosophy becomes truly demanding, because it requires not that you change your circumstances, but that you fundamentally transform your own nature. The principle is almost brutal in its simplicity. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. This is not a statement about physical strength or external power. It is a statement about internal resilience and the elimination of vulnerabilities. The weak self that must be destroyed is not weakness itself. Weakness is inevitable in certain domains. Rather, it is a specific type of weakness. The weakness that comes from self-deception, from neediness, from the hunger for approval and validation. The weak self is the part of you that believes you need other people's permission to pursue your goals. It is the voice inside you that asks, "What will they think?" before you take action. It is the internal critic that has internalized the judgments of others and now enforces them on your behalf. This weak self is constructed through years of conditioning, from childhood onward. We are taught to care what others think, to seek approval, to avoid shame and criticism. These lessons are so deeply embedded that most people never question them. But Machiavelli understood something fundamental. This weak self is not your true self. It is a construct, a collection of fears and borrowed values that you have accepted as identity. And because it is a construct, it can be dismantled. The question is whether you have the courage to do so. The weak self manifests in specific behaviors that make you vulnerable to the three types mentioned earlier. When you possess a weak self, you are susceptible to the envious person because you care deeply about their opinion and their validation. You work harder to prove yourself to them, to earn their approval. This effort only increases their envy and deepens the dynamic. When you possess a weak self, you are vulnerable to the chronic complainer because you feel responsible for their happiness. You attempt to rescue them, to prove that success is possible, to somehow demonstrate to them that the world is not as cruel as they believe. This effort is futile and draining, and it prevents you from attending to your own ascent. When you possess a weak self, you are most vulnerable to the betrayer because you have not developed the capacity to observe people clearly. Instead, you see them through the lens of your own hopes and projections. You believe they are better than they are because you want them to be. You ignore evidence of their nature because acknowledging it would require you to admit that you were wrong, that you misjudged them, that you allowed someone into your trust who did not deserve it. Your weak self cannot bear this acknowledgement, so you rationalize, excuse, and eventually you are betrayed. The destruction of the weak self begins with the recognition that other people's opinions of you are not facts. They are merely perspectives, shaped by that person's own wounds, insecurities, and limitations. When the envious person criticizes you, they are not delivering objective truth. They are expressing their own inadequacy projected onto you. When the chronic complainer questions whether your success is meaningful, they are not making a philosophical argument. They are defending against the implications of your success for their own self-image. When the betrayer abandons you, they are not revealing something true about you. They are revealing what they always were. This shift in perspective is the beginning of liberation from the weak self. You stop looking to others to validate your path and your progress. You develop an internal measure of success that is not dependent on external approval. This does not mean you stop listening to legitimate feedback or shut yourself off from the perspectives of wise people. Rather, it means you develop the discrimination to distinguish between feedback that is genuinely useful and criticism that is merely the projection of another person's limitations. The destruction of the weak self continues through the deliberate cultivation of self-respect. Self-respect is not arrogance or narcissism. It is a recognition that your time, energy, and attention are valuable resources that should not be squandered on people who do not deserve them. It is a commitment to your own growth that supersedes the comfort of maintaining relationships with toxic people. It is an acknowledgement that including a betrayer in your life out of a misplaced sense of kindness or obligation is not benevolence, it is self-sabotage. Self-respect requires that you set boundaries and that you enforce them consistently. It requires that you say no to people who have demonstrated that they operate without integrity. It requires that you remove yourself from situations in which your presence validates dysfunction. Many people struggle with these actions because they have internalized a message that boundaries are selfish, that rejection is cruel, that distancing yourself from others is a failure of compassion. Machiavelli would counter that the failure of compassion is not in setting boundaries but in failing to set them, because this allows toxic people to continue their destructive patterns unchecked. The destruction of the weak self also involves the cultivation of what might be called strategic selfishness. This is not the selfishness of greed or domination. It is the selfishness of someone who understands that they cannot pour from an empty cup, that they cannot serve others effectively if they are depleted, and that their own vision and goals are legitimate and worthy of pursuit. When you stop apologizing for your ambition, when you stop explaining why your success is justified, when you stop performing gratitude for the approval of others, in that moment, you become genuinely difficult to manipulate or destroy. The weak self also manifests in a desperate need for certainty. You want to know that people will treat you well, that your efforts will be rewarded, that the world follows rational rules. When you encounter someone who violates these expectations, you experience profound disorientation. You cannot believe they would betray you, so you attribute their behavior to something temporary or external. You believe that if you just treat them better, they will change. This desperate need for certainty about other people's behavior leaves you vulnerable because you are constantly being surprised. The destruction of the weak self requires that you accept fundamental uncertainty. You cannot know for certain that others will treat you well. You cannot guarantee that your efforts will be rewarded. You cannot prevent betrayal, but you can limit your exposure to betrayers. You cannot change the envious person's nature, but you can refuse to be affected by their envy. You cannot rescue the chronic complainer, but you can refuse to be pulled down by their despair. This acceptance of uncertainty is not pessimism. It is realism, and it is liberating, because it relieves you of the impossible burden of trying to control other people's behavior. As you destroy your weak self, something remarkable begins to happen. The toxic people in your life become less able to harm you. This is not because they change. It is because you have changed. When you stop seeking approval from the envious person, their envy loses its power to affect you. When you stop trying to rescue the chronic complainer, their despair no longer drains you. When you stop trying to maintain relationships with betrayers, their betrayals can no longer hurt you because you are no longer invested in them. Moreover, something else occurs. The three dangerous types begin to drift away from you. Envious people lose interest in someone who is not seeking their validation. Chronic complainers find someone else to drain. Betrayers seek targets who are more vulnerable and more trusting. By destroying your weak self, you have eliminated what attracted them to you in the first place. This is the final wisdom of Machiavelli's cold rule for survival. The man who destroys his weak self not only becomes impervious to destruction by others, but he also removes himself from the orbit of those who would seek to destroy him. He becomes uninteresting to toxic people, and he develops the clarity to avoid them before they embed themselves in his life. This is not a promise of avoiding all difficulty or conflict. It is a promise that such difficulties and conflicts will no longer come from within your circle of trust, because you will have chosen your circle with wisdom and maintained it with discrimination. The practical implementation of this philosophy requires courage. It requires that you examine your relationships with clear eyes and identify which of the three types are present in your life. It requires that you have difficult conversations in which you distance yourself from people who have proven themselves untrustworthy. It requires that you tolerate the guilt and discomfort that arises when you set boundaries, especially with people who will characterize your boundaries as cruelty or abandonment. It requires that you develop the capacity to be alone, to trust your own judgment, and to move forward without the approval of others. But the reward for this courage is profound. Once you have destroyed your weak self and learned to identify and avoid the three dangerous types, you gain something that most people never achieve: the freedom to fully pursue your vision without the constant undermining that comes from toxic relationships. You gain the peace of mind that comes from knowing that the people in your circle are genuinely invested in your success, not threatened by it. You gain the clarity to make decisions based on principle rather than the fear of judgment or abandonment. This is Machiavelli's cold rule for survival, refined through centuries of observation and experience. It is not comforting, and it will not make you popular, but it is reliable, and it works. The man who learns to see the three types without illusion and who has the courage to destroy his weak self becomes genuinely difficult to harm, not because he is strong in the way the world typically measures strength, but because he has eliminated the vulnerabilities that give others power over him. In this way, the paradox resolves itself. By accepting that you cannot control others, you gain control over your circumstances. By abandoning the desperate need for approval, you become worthy of respect. By refusing to be destroyed by your own weakness, you become impossible to destroy by others. This is the path Machiavelli illuminates, and it remains as relevant in the modern world as it was in Renaissance Florence.